In this assignment, I'll be looking at working ethically and legally on research projects and implications around not working legally or ethically. On this slide, I am explaining the difference between ethics and legal issues. Ethics are people's moral principles and the difference between right and wrong. There are some cases where things can be legal but might be seen as ethically wrong. For example, the Milgram experiment. This broke no laws, however it did cause some pathological harm to the participants, which can be seen as ethically wrong. Scientists, before completing an experiment, have to send a report of exactly what they wish to do during the experiment to an ethics committee. These people will review the proposed experiment and will decide if the scientist is allowed to carry it out or not. To work legally in an experiment, the scientist must work within the boundaries of the law, which are decided by the government and enforced by the police of the country they are working in. The legal side of the experiment are a lot more defined as to what is right and wrong compared to the ethics, as people have different moral beliefs. Over the next few slides, I'll be looking at considerations that need to be made to make sure a scientific experiment is both ethical and legally approved. As you can see on this slide, I have the acronym DRIP. This stands for Deception, Right to Withdraw, Informed Consent, Protection from Harm, and Privacy. Deception means that as a scientist doing a research project, you must make sure that you have not deceived the test subjects in any way, and they know what they're getting themselves in for. An example of when this was broken was during the Milgram shock experiment. Right to withdraw means that the test subjects can remove not just themselves but also their data from the experiment at any time they wish to. An example of when this was an issue was during the Lamboyd-Stanford prison experiment. The prisoners would say they wanted to leave, but the guards would pressure them into staying. The scientists in charge of the experiment didn't step in and say they could leave except in extreme circumstances. Informed consent means that before agreeing to take part in the experiment, the test subjects must know what they're getting themselves in for, but must also be in the right frame of mind to agree. So, for a child, a parent and carer must make the decision. This is the same for people with mental disabilities. Protection from harm means that no harm should occur, whether psychological or physical, towards the test subjects at any time. Privacy means that the test subjects' results should be kept confidentially and no name should ever be released. On this slide I have another acronym, the 4 C's. This stands for Competence, Consent, Confidentiality and Conduct. Competence means that the scientists administrating the experiment should have the knowledge and training to be able to complete the experiment. Consent is the same as informed consent in DRIP, when the subject must be in the right frame of mind and age to be able to consent to the experiment. Confidentiality is also the same as privacy in DRIP, when no name should ever be used when publishing the results. Conduct means that the scientists performing the experiment should always behave appropriately throughout, and their conduct should remain professional at all times. Here I have another acronym, which is BASIS. This stands for the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science. This is a governing body which will endorse sport scientists and put their name towards the scientists' research. BASIS will have a code of conduct they expect any scientist to follow throughout their experiment if they want to be accredited by BASIS. Over the next 5 slides I have scenarios, all involving young gymnasts, that are experiments where there is potential for legal and ethical issues to arise. The first scenario is that as a scientist, you're trying to establish whether the BMI of a young female gymnast aged between 11 and 16 will affect their flexibility. In this scenario, there are a few potential issues. The first is that the gymnasts are all children, so the scientists will have to be CRB checked. Secondly, the informed consent must be made by a parent or guardian. Thirdly, while testing the flexibility, the scientists will have to make sure they keep a professional conduct, especially as they're young females and the scientist could potentially be a man. They may need somebody else in the ring. Lastly, the gymnast BMI might be embarrassing, so The scores will have to be kept private and confidential at all times. In this scenario, you are trying to see if punishment or failure will improve the gymnast's routine. Again, this is with young female gymnasts. From this, the key issues that could arise are the scientist has not been clear as to exactly how bad the subject will be punished, so an informed consent cannot be made. Also, again, it's young females under the age of consent, so a parent or guardian is needed to make the consent. And at least 2 people will need to be present if the scientist is dealing with young girls who could be very vulnerable. The scientist will also need to be CRB checked. In this third scenario, it involves the scientist trying to determine if the somatotype of young female gymnasts has a direct influence on the type of routines they can perform. In this, the scientist must be competent and know a certain amount about gymnastics, as they're trying to judge how good the performance really is. Secondly, the gymnast may be embarrassed by their somatotype, so the results should remain confidential. Again, the scientist hasn't been clear on the type of routines they are expected the test subjects to complete, so an informed consent can't be given. Lastly, the girls need a parent or carer to give the consent as they're underage. The scientist should make sure they're never on their room on their own with the underage girls, and also should make sure they are CRB checked. In this scenario, the scientist is investigating whether smoking will directly affect the scores gymnasts will get on a routine. From this, there are several potential issues. Firstly, when dealing with young girls, the scientist needs to make sure they're CRB checked. Secondly, the scientist needs to be competent enough to judge a routine. Thirdly, the scientist has to find gymnasts of a similar level where some do smoke and some don't smoke, because it's ethically wrong to get a young female gymnast to smoke for the purpose of an experiment. Lastly, as the girls are underage, any consent needs to be given by parents or carers. In this scenario, you're looking at how the blood lactate levels of the young gymnast increase after doing routines of increasing difficulty. The key issue with this is that the scientist informs the test subject of exactly how the blood lactate will be given, so an informed consent can be given. Other issues are things like making sure the scientist is competent enough to administer the test for the blood lactate. Again, the scientist needs to make sure that the consent is given by a parent or carer as the girls are all underage. Also needs to make sure they have a CRB check. On this slide, I'll be looking at the implications of not working ethically or legally. The key implications are that the scientists could lose support. This means that their research career will effectively be over, as without support they will not have the funds to carry out more experiments. The scientists could lose accreditation, which means that their work will no longer be supported by people like Becky. The scientists could even be fined, or in extreme circumstances they could receive a prison sentence. The severity of the punishment will depend on how bad the scientist has messed up. For example, in scenario 1, if the scientist fails to get an informed consent, then they may find that any accreditation or support they get from doing the experiment is removed, and they could receive a small fine.